In today's video, we're going to deploy a Python FastAPI project into AWS ECS. So let's get into it. Hello, this is Marco speaking. In the previous videos, we created and updated our AI voice assistant. Now it's time to deploy it on a cloud provider, in our case AWS, so the whole world can access our amazing project. Today we're going to deploy the backend side, which was made using Python and FastAPI in AWS Elastic Container Service, aka ECS, using HTTPS and a custom domain. Why do we need to use HTTPS in our case? Because the front end also requires HTTPS. Why is that? Because in our case, the front end uses the microphone library, and the microphone library does not work with regular HTTP. So this is why everything needs to use HTTPS so the front end can work properly and you can communicate properly with our AI voice assistant. So let's get into it. But before we proceed, if you like this kind of content, just give me a thumbs up, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you can learn more about Python and AWS infrastructure. And never forget that the more learn and practice you have, the better you become and more value you can provide. So let's do this. So, in order to deploy a project on ECS, we need to follow some steps. First, we need to update our code base to work properly with Docker. So we need to update the code and create the Dockerfile. Second, we need to create the ECR image from our code. If you prefer, you can also use Docker Hub. But in my case, I'm going to keep everything inside my AWS account. So I'm going to stick to ECR. Third, create the ECS cluster. In our case, we're going to use Fargate. When you create an ECS cluster to run your applications, you have two options. You can use EC2, so everything will have a server running behind, or you can use serverless with Fargate. In my case, I'm going to use Fargate and serverless to run the application. Fourth, create and set up the task definition using the ECR image. This is where you define how your task is going to run. You define how much CPU, how much RAM, GPU, the environment variables, and so on for your task to run on ECS. Fifth, deploy the service from task definition into the ECS cluster. This is where we take our task definition that we created previously and actually run it on ECS cluster. And the last step, this is an extra. Since we are using HTTPS and a custom domain, we also need to set up Route 53 and a custom domain for our service on ECS. So let's get into it. Okay, great. So this is the backend code that we developed previously. So if you were following the AI voice assistant series, I need to notify you about a few things. First, I created this root route for our application. So whenever we access our custom domain without any path param, we're gonna see this JSON object being displayed. Hello world from MPCSJ. I created this so it gets easier for us to check if the application is properly working when we deploy it on ECS. Second, since we are using Poetry for our application, by default, Poetry does not create the requirements.txt file from Python. So how did I create this file using Poetry? I used the Poetry export command. So this Poetry export command allows us to create the requirements.txt file. So it gets easier for us to deploy the application using Docker and a Docker container on ECS. Third, I had to update our assistant controller and add this /API prefix. So since the front end was created using Next, So I had to make this change because the way that I connected the front end to the back end, I had to make this change so both applications can communicate properly when we deploy them on ECS. And that's it. Besides this, I also created this Dockerfile. This is the Dockerfile from step 1 that we mentioned previously to deploy the application on ECS. So here we can see that the application uses Python 3.8-slim. This is the base image from our application. Then we create this work directory /app. Then we install FFmpeg in our application. Since we use FFmpeg to transcode the audio, then we need to install it in our container. Then we install the AWS CLI for our application, since we're using AWS and AWS Poly. After doing this, we had to copy the entire code base into our work directory inside the container. Then we install the requirements txt file in our Python application, and then we define the command to start the container. And that's pretty much it. This is our Dockerfile for our application and the changes that we had to do to make everything work properly. Perfect. Now let's go to AWS and set up the whole thing to run our Docker application. So here we are on AWS console. The first thing that we need to do, which is step 2, is to go to ECR and create the image. So let's create a repository here. It's going to be private. I don't want everybody else to access my container image. So I'm going to call it AI Voice Assistant Backend. Perfect. And that's pretty much it for now. And then we create the repository. Let me see. That's it. Now we have an empty repository here on ECS. Let's click here. And then let's see the push commands to push our code base to ECR. First, we need to authenticate into ECR using this command here. Let's go here and authenticate. Perfect. Now we need to build our backend image. Perfect. Then we need to tag. We need to tag our image. And then we push our Docker image to ECR. Okay, great. After a few minutes, our application was properly deployed on ECR. It can take us some time. It depends on how fast your internet connection is. So let's go back here to ECR and refresh the page. So we can see here that the image was properly deployed here on ECR. Now let's go to ECS to set up our cluster. Let's click here into ECS and prepare everything. The first thing that we need to do is to create our cluster. So let's click here. So I'm gonna call it AI Voice Assistant Cluster. It's up to you. In our case, we're gonna use Fargate. Since we want to create a serverless application, then we need to use Fargate. If you want to use EC2 instances under the hood, then you have to select the second option. In our case, we're only going to use Fargate. And let's create the cluster. Perfect. Now our cluster is being created on CloudFormation, and this can take a few minutes to be ready. I forgot to mention that depending on your operating system, you have to start your Docker engine before running the application. In my case, since I'm using macOS, by default, the Docker engine is not running. So I had to start the Docker engine so everything works properly, so we can properly build and deploy the image into AWS ECR. Okay, perfect. After a few minutes, our cluster was created. So here we can see our cluster, and by default, there is no service running here. So in order to run a service on our cluster, first we need to define our task definition. This is where we define what is the kind of task that we want to run inside the cluster. So let's click here to create a new task definition. So this is going to be the backend. So I'm gonna call it AI Voice Assistant Backend. We're gonna use Fargate for our task. So for the operating system, you have to check the kind of computer that generated the image. Since I'm using a M1 Pro computer, so my computer uses an ARM processor. So I need to select ARM64. If I try to build the ECR image and deploy it using x86, it's not gonna work. So since I'm using a M1 Pro which uses the ARM architecture, then I need to deploy my application using ARM64. If you are using x86 machine, then you need to select here x86 if you previously decided to build your image using x86. But in my case, it's going to be ARM64. Perfect. In my case, I want to use only one CPU, and I believe that 2 GB is fine for me to run my application. Then I need to select a task role. So I'm going to select one of the roles that I previously created. You need to pay attention here because depending on the permissions that your task execution role has, it may not work properly. When you try to deploy your service, you will see that probably it will fail because your ECS task execution role doesn't have the right permissions to proceed and deploy your service on ECS. Perfect. So here on container 1 is where we actually select our container image. So we basically need to go here to our image, select the URI, and then paste it here. So I'm gonna call it the same name as I defined here on ECS. Perfect. In our case, the container port is 80. Since we define here on the Docker image to run on port 80. And that's pretty much it. For the backend, we don't need any environment variable, but we're gonna need it for the front end. So if you want to use the log collection, you have to update your ECS task execution role for creating logs properly. So let's go, for example, to IAM, and let's check this IAM role. So let's go to roles and search for our ECS task execution role. Go here, and then in my case, I already have a role for ECS. This is the IAM role that I'm using. So in my case, I'm using these 4 permissions to run everything properly. In order to create a role for ECS, what you have to do, you have to go to roles, and then you click to create role, and then you select ECS, actually Elastic Container Service, and then you say that you want to create this role for ECS. Then you click on next, and then you attach the permissions that we want to use for ECS. I'm gonna call it test new ECS role. And then you click to create the role. I'm gonna copy this and create the role. So when we go back here to ECS, we can see it. Probably now it's not gonna work because I have to refresh the page to see the new role. I'm not gonna do this, but I'm not gonna use this task as well. I already have a task with all the permissions for the container to run, which is this ECS task execution role. Perfect. And then once you select the Fargate, you select the operating system and the architecture, you select how many CPU you need, how many gigabytes of RAM do you need, your execution role, your container, the port you're gonna use for your application, the environment variables, which we're not gonna use in our case. Then you just create. Oh yeah, I have to select. If you need some ephemeral memory, you also put it here. By default, it's gonna be 21. So I'm gonna put here 21, which is the minimal that ECS accepts. And then we create our task definition. Perfect. Now our task definition was properly created. Let's go back to our cluster, click on the cluster, and create a new service. So I'm gonna use here Fargate. So this is where we actually create the service which is going to run on ECS. So for compute options, we select launch type here, and we select ECS, and then we select Fargate. For deployment configuration, we have two options. We can deploy a service, which is a long-running service like a web service, or a task if you want to run, for example, a batch job. In our case, it's a web backend application, then it needs to be a long-running service. The family is going to be the task definition that we previously deployed. The revision is going to be the latest. I'm going to call it AI Voice Assistant Backend Service. Perfect. I'm only going to use one task. We don't need Service Connect. We don't need Service Discovery. By default, it's going to use all the subnets from our current VPC. But in our case, we need to select the load balancing, and then we select here an application load balancer. And then we create a new load balancer, AI Voice Assistant Backend LB. Perfect. So since we're going to use HTTPS, so the port needs to be 443, and the protocol is going to be HTTPS rather than HTTP. And for the certificate, I'm going to select my existing certificate that I created on ECS. The target group, I'm going to call it the same thing, but instead of LB at the end, I'm going to put TG. So how this is going to work, the load balancer will be responsible for configuring HTTPS. So the HTTPS will end at the load balancer. So the connection between your computer and the load balancer is going to have HTTPS, but from the load balancer to the application is going to be a regular HTTP. This is fine for our use case. For having a ACM certificate, you need to create it previously on ACM, which is Certificate Manager Service from AWS. In my case, I already have this certificate, and I also have a domain as well. So for having a domain, we have to buy a domain somewhere else and then create a hosted zone on Route 53. Once we have a hosted zone, you can create a certificate and point the certificate to the hosted zone. Perfect. And that's pretty much it. Let's review the whole thing. And then we create our service. Now let's wait a little bit for our service to be ready to be used. Okay, perfect. After a few minutes, our service was properly deployed on ECS. If in your case the task failed to be deployed, your service failed to be deployed, you need to go to the Tasks tab, and see the task. It's gonna be red here, or if you can't see it, try to filter for any desired status, and then you will see the failed task. Then you click on the task, and then you're gonna see an error message here. Probably it's gonna be some permission that you need to add in your IAM role. So you will see the message, you will see like, oh, your IAM role doesn't have permission for do XYZ. Then you copy the message, and then you basically update your IAM role to have the proper permission. And that's pretty much it. Now let's go back to our service. This is our backend service. You can go to logs to see our application, and as you can see here, our container is running properly on ECS. So how do we connect to our application? Since we're using a load balancer, now we need to go to the Route 53 and set up our custom domain. For doing this, you must buy and set up a Route 53 before doing this. So this is my hosted zone on Route 53, and this is the domain that I bought previously. So let's click here. Let's create a new record. I'm gonna call it AI Voice Assistant Backend. The name is up to you. It's gonna be an alias. So we click here. Then we select that we want to point to a load balancer, since we're using a load balancer to handle the HTTPS. So it's gonna be an alias to an application and classic load balancer. So we click here and then we choose the region. In our case, we are using the Oregon region, which is the US West 2. So we need to select here US West 2, which is this one. And then we select our load balancer. Since we already selected the SSL certificate when we created the ECS service, then it's gonna show up automatically here for us the option for the correct load balancer. If you have multiple load balancers using the same SSL certificate, then you need to see which one is the correct. So we select here in our case, and then we click to create the record. Then we click to see the status. And then we need to wait like a few seconds for the domain to be ready for us. Okay, perfect. After a few seconds, the domain is ready. So I'm gonna open up the browser. Actually, I'm gonna use Chrome for testing this. And then here, I'm gonna paste the domain that we just created. And that's it. Hello world from MPCSJ. And as you can see, our backend is properly running on AWS ECS. And that's it. Now you have a Python FastAPI application properly running on AWS ECS with HTTPS and a custom domain. I hope you liked it, and I see you in the next time.